A True Picture of Emigration by Rebecca and Edward Burlend, Chapter 4, read by Carol Lisa O'Brien. During the time we were at lodgings, we had felt ourselves dependent, and looked forward with anxious expectation to the time when we might again taste the sweets and independence of home, and those enjoyments which are only to be expected at one's own fireside. That period had now arrived. We had indeed a house such as I have already described, but we had no furniture except 2 large boxes, 2 beds, and a few pots and cooking utensils. Besides, our provisions were just finished. Till this time we had been using principally the remains of biscuits, etc., purchased at New Orleans. The first wants of nature must be first attended to. Whether we had a chair to sit on or not, something to eat we must have. Our nearest neighbor lived about a half a mile from us, and we were at least 2.5 miles from any place at which flour was sold. Thither, however, my husband went, and as our money was growing scarce, he bought a bushel of ground Indian corn, which was only 1/3 the price of wheat and flour. It was there sold for 30 cents a bushel. Its taste is not pleasant to persons as unaccustomed to it, but as it is wholesome food, it is much used for making bread. We had now some meal, but no yeast, nor an oven. We were therefore obliged to make sad paste and bake it in our frying pan on some hot ashes. We procured a little milk from our nearest neighbor, Mr. Paddock, which, on account of the severe frosts that prevail in Illinois, we generally received in lumps of ice. Thus we lived the first few weeks at our new estate. Hasty pudding, sad bread, and a little venison which we had left were our ordinary food. The greater part of my husband's time was spent in cutting and preparing wood for our fires. About this time we made further purchases of a cow and calf, for which we paid $14, a young mare, which cost us $20, 2 pigs, and a shallow flat-bottomed iron pan with a cover on it to bake in. This is the common and indeed almost the only kind of oven used in Illinois. It is vulgarly called a skillet. To make it hot, it is immersed in glowing embers. The lid is then removed till the dough is put in. It is then replaced and ashes again thrown over it till the cake is baked. Hence it will be perceived that a quantity of bread beforehand is unknown in Illinois. Their custom is to bake cake to each meal, which is generally very good. Eggs and milk, being so plentiful, are regularly used in their bread, along with a little saleratus to lighten it, whereby it becomes very rich and nutritive. The Illinois settlers live somewhat differently from the English peasantry. The former have only 3 meals a day, and not much variety in them. Bread, butter, coffee, and bacon are always brought to the table, but fresh meat is a rarity, and is never obtained, as in England, by going to a butcher for it. In Illinois, the farmers all kill their own cattle, and salt what is not used immediately. Sometimes, however, they distribute portions among their neighbors, with the view of receiving as much again when they kill theirs. It is by no means uncommon for an old settler to have a couple of fowls, ducks, a goose, or a turkey to dinner, and generally speaking, everybody has plenty of plain good food. The object contemplated in this work requires that I should occasionally leave my own history to render more complete the information I have to impart. I hope, therefore, the reader will not think me incoherent. To proceed, we bought the livestock above described of Mr. Oakes, and as it was winter, we wanted something with which to feed them. Indian corn is nearly the only winter food used in Illinois, and as the culture and management of it occupy a great portion of the farmer's time and industry, it may not be out of place to explain the method of cultivating it. The land intended for Indian corn should be plowed and harrowed once or twice to make the earth loose and mellow, that the roots may strike with greater freedom. Furrows are then made at a distance of about 1 yard from each other. These are afterwards crossed by other furrows made at right angles to the first and about the same distance apart. By this means the field appears divided into numberless little square portions, each somewhat less than a square yard, as if hollowed at the center. Into each of these crossings 4 seeds are thrown, and slightly covered with a hoe. This is done in the beginning of March, and after the young blades make their appearance, the plow is occasionally drawn through between the rows for the purpose of checking weeds and keeping the mold as light as possible. As these groups of plants are so far apart, kidney beans, melons, and pumpkins are frequently sown among them, for which the strong stems of the corn are excellent supports. Indian corn usually ripens about the beginning of October, and is of immense produce. There are commonly 4 or 5 ears to each stem, each having from 500 to 1,000 grains in it. Footnote. It seems probable that Edward Burlend, who never saw America, misunderstood what his mother actually told him concerning the corn crop. A yield of 4 or 5 ears of corn to a single stalk is so uncommon that the editor, who grew up on an Iowa farm, cannot remember ever having seen a single example. The Illinois river bottom land is very rich and still produces splendid crops of corn, but the statement that a yield of 4 or 5 ears to the stalk was common even a century ago is evidently erroneous. End of footnote. As the ears ripen, they gradually assume a pendant form and are in that position severally overhung with the leaves of the plant, which form a sort of sheath, securely protecting them from rain. In this manner, when properly ripened, it will remain in perfect safety all winter uncut. And as it by no means is uncommon to sow the land with wheat before the corn crop is all removed, it is not always allowed to ripen. Part of the crop is often cut when the corn is about half fed, which being dried in the sun, the stem and leaves make excellent hay. In this state it is both hay and corn, and is in fact the only hay the farmer preserves for winter, of which he makes small stacks of a peculiar construction so as not to require thatching. Nothing can be more beautiful than a field of Indian corn in full blossom, and perhaps nothing in nature displays the munificence of Providence more strikingly than this matchless plant. In order to supply our cattle with winter meat, we applied to Mr. Paddock, our nearest neighbor, who sold us part of a field unreaped. Some of it we cut down and took home, and the rest we allowed to stand and turned our cattle to it. The reader may think it strange that we should turn cattle into the fields in the depth of winter, especially as the winters are there more severe than in England. It is, however, the regular custom. The cattle are inured to it, as they are never kept up any part of the year, either day or night. The two pigs we had bought we were obliged to kill shortly after we purchased them, as we wanted them for our own use, and we wished to spare the small stock of Indian corn we had on hand. The reader must also know our money was nearly done. I believe we had not more than $4 or $5 remaining. Part of it we were obliged to spend in sulphur to cure what is known as the Illinois mange, from which we were all suffering. The complaint invariably attacks new settlers shortly after their arrival, and is a complete scourge until it is removed. The body breaks out all over in little spots, attended with intolerable itching. It is generally attributed to the change of water, but as theirs possesses no peculiarity of taste, I cannot understand how that can be the cause. We were soon cured after using the sulphur, and never felt anything more of it. Footnote. The Illinois mange, a well-known pioneer affliction, as the name itself indicates, seems not to trouble present-day denizens of Pike County. Mr. Francis Allen, a grandson of our author and now 80 years of age, who has lived his entire life in the county, informed the editor that he had never heard of the disease. Jess M. Thompson, however, local historian and great-grandson of Mrs. Burlend, is familiar with its early-day prevalence in the county. He relates that local opinion attributed its occurrence to the rotting of plowed-under vegetation. Another theory attributed its ravages to the decayed fish which perished with the drying up of ponds along the river bottoms. At Atlas, Pike County, the disease assumed the proportions of an epidemic in 1821, when many of the settlers died from it. End of footnote. It has already been said that when we entered our house we had no furniture. This inconvenience my husband, although no joiner, had undertaken to remove by making for himself and me each a stool and a low bench for our children, or more properly a log of wood, squared and laid across the hearth for a seat. He had also contrived to make a table, which, if not as neat as those used in England, was quite as substantial. Having met with a section of a strong tree about 2 feet long, he rolled it into the house and set it up on its end. Had it been a little longer, its upper surface would have been just what we wanted. We, however, nailed a few boards upon it, making them fit as well as we could, and having covered it with a cloth to conceal its roughness, it was far from being contemptible, at least for persons like us, who had been some days without any. As to bedsteads, we were a few weeks before we got any. Of course we had them to make ourselves. and as we were ill furnished with tools and unaccustomed to such employment, when they were finished they served rather to show how little ornament is absolutely necessary than our skill as expert carpenters. Hitherto the light of the fire had served us instead of a candle, which was very inconvenient, as I wished to sew a little in the evenings. It is certainly true that days are never so short as in England. Nevertheless, we were very wishful to have some candles. The inhabitants commonly make their own, in tin molds, and as we had neither molds nor tallow, we were obliged to put a little lard into a saucer and light a piece of rag previously inserted into it. By this we could see to sew and read pretty well, but as the rag frequently got immersed in the melted lard, it was very troublesome, and by constant use we had 3 or 4 saucers broken with the heat, a circumstance much to be regretted, as pots of all kinds are dear in Illinois. To prevent a recurrence of this misfortune, we ultimately made use of our kettle lid, inserting the knob or holder into a piece of board to make it stand. Our next great inconvenience was want of soap. Having, however, learned from Mrs. Phillips the method of making it, we were by this time in a state of readiness for supplying ourselves. The reader will remember we had before this time killed 2 pigs, the entrails of which we had cleaned and preserved, along with the bits of offal, rendering, scraps, etc. And now the finest of our ashes were collected and put into a large wooden trough, and boiling water poured over them, whence we obtained a strong solution of potash, which we poured off and boiled down. Fresh ashes were then used as before, and a fresh solution obtained. The whole was next boiled down to about 1/3 of the original quantity, by which means the solution became so caustic that it would have taken the skin off one's fingers in a moment. In this state the waste meat and entrails were mixed with it, which it very soon assimilated. After it obtained the consistency of soft soap, it was poured into a vessel appropriated for the purpose, to be ready for use. This is the manner the American peasantry supply themselves with soap. Their practice of burning wood furnishes them with potash, which they saturate with other ingredients as above described. Since we were thus obliged to provide necessaries for ourselves in a manner very different from that to which we had been accustomed in England, it may be asked if there were no shops in that country. Illinois, it must be known, is very thinly populated, and on that account it is not the situation for shopkeepers. There are, however, in various places what are termed storekeepers, who supply the settlers with articles the most needed, such as food, clothing, implements of husbandry, medicine, and spirituous liquors, for which they receive in exchange the produce of their farms, consisting of wheat, Indian corn, sugar, beef, bacon, etc. As these storekeepers exercise a sort of monopoly over a certain district, their profits are great, and they often become wealthy. Besides their store, they often have a sawmill and corn mill, at which they grind the corn they obtain from the farmers for the purpose of sending it to New Orleans or some other place where it can be readily sold. Stores, therefore, are in Illinois nearly what markets are in England, only there is more barter in the former country. The mills in that neighborhood are chiefly turned by water. We were destined to be unfortunate with the young mare we had purchased of Mr. Oakes. Having been accustomed to run in the fields with other horses, she would not settle with our cow and calf. Every day she was lost. No fences could turn her. We were therefore obliged to sell her, or rather exchange for one not near so good, only she was expected to have a foal the following spring. Shortly after we had parted with the young mare, my husband found 2 strange horses in the field feeding upon our corn. He turned them out and returned home. On going to the field again, they were there a second time. He felt assured someone had turned them in, as the fences were all good. The next day explained the circumstance, for the horses being in the field as before, he was about to drive them out, when a tall man hastened toward him and bade him desist, telling him that the horses were his and he intended them to be there. My husband remonstrated with him on the injustice of such behavior, and persevered in his attempts to drive them out, at which the person, whose name was Brevet, went up to him and struck him a blow on the forehead with a fist, and threatened further violence if he did not allow them to remain. Seeing that physical force was the only available argument, my husband began to prepare for resistance, but calling to mind the situation of his family, and not knowing what perfidy might be resorted to, he wisely concluded to leave the man and his horses where they were. I mention this circumstance principally to show how much we were indebted to the overruling Providence for the preservation of my husband's life on this occasion. We afterwards learnt that Brevet was a pest to the neighborhood, and that he had told one of his acquaintances of this interview, and declared he would have stabbed my partner with a large dirk which he always carried with him, if he had resisted. In a short time afterwards he left the neighborhood, dreaded and detested by all who knew him. End of part 1.